Chapter 12. Once the dust from the blast had settled, and the explosive flashes faded into the murky dust, the alien shook its head as its vision began to return. It peered down at Hawkins' naked corpse, its prehensile spur piercing deep into the Irishman's thigh, as if the body were a side of meat hanging from a butcher's hook. With some difficulty, the creature dragged its newest victim through the vine-webbed tangles of jungle like a sack of stones. It had no concept of the heart loss that attended an Earthling's death, or the rage it had stirred in the surviving commandos. Killing was simply a means to an end, and had no more significance than the ploughing down of the trees to make room for the spaceship. Only the lower species ever died on the alien's home planet. The higher forms so endlessly transformed themselves that they never inhabited a body long enough to die. They sloughed themselves like snakeskins. Therefore the creature dissected these killer soldiers as dispassionately and as carefully as a clockmaker might dismantle an unusually subtle timepiece. Obsessively it probed to locate the center of man's identity by analyzing every millimeter of flesh and bone. Though it hadn't succeeded yet, it had already figured that the skull and perhaps the spinal cord were crucial pieces of the puzzle. The rest of the body was patently clumsy and unimportant, discardable like packaging. The alien hauled the body through the night for about half a mile till it reached what looked like a dry lake bed in a thick expanse of cottonwood trees. The lake bed was like a bowl at the base of a jagged hill 5 miles from the Contamana border. An odd, surreal bluish glow filtered through the cottonwood branches, like a full moon's bathing glow on a clear night. Yet here it shone at ground level like a fallen star, and tinted with an aqua sheen like the shallows of the Caribbean. The eerie light emanated from the alien spacecraft, which had set down in the middle of the lake bed. Here was the egg-shaped ship, in which the creature had travelled 16 million miles on its single-minded search for a sense of self. And for the second time. The lake bed had been hollowed out by its fiery landing 1,000 years before. For this trip, it had honed in on automatic pilot. The oval-shaped craft sat ominously still, its smooth metallic shell glowing with a copper patina. The alien stood before it, and with a gesture like a blessing, raised a 3-fingered hand. A ramp extended from the side of the ship and lowered to the ground, seemingly suspended on a dozen lasers. The intruder from another world hefted the bloody body over its shoulder, walked up into the ship, and slung down its newest prize. The silence was broken by the dull thump of the body hitting the cold tungsten floor. With vastly concentrated strength, its spur still snagged deep in the human flesh, the alien punctured the skin at the base of Hawkins' spine with its other claw-like hand, severing the cord like a knife through butter. Then it bore upward, ripping at the vertebrae. Stubbornly, it yanked harder, pulling the entire spine free of the body, a sickly snapping and popping of cartilage echoing off the chamber walls as bone separated from tissue. Without a trace of emotion, the alien bore the head and spine into a further chamber of the ship, leaving a ghostly trail of blood and flesh on the pristine floor. It entered an oval room, illuminated by an intense blue light. The marauder laid the sacred remains on its autopsy table, and stood back, watching as the light from above shifted to a yellowish orange. Then, with the help of laser technology centuries beyond the Earth's, the connective tissue clinging to the bones shriveled and disintegrated into tiny mounds of dust. Then the light changed to a soft green, and the alien lifted the skull column and admired the trophy under the light. It was as smooth and white as a steer's skeleton in the desert, picked clean by scavengers and bleached for years by the sun. The alien reached out and placed it precisely on a glowing shelf along one side of the ship, caressing it gently, proudly, as one might a prized artifact from an ancient civilization. It felt of the texture and stroked the hollows with a haunting detachment. As the green light glowed ever more triumphant, it became evident that this was only one of many such trophies displayed around the room. It was some otherworldly equivalent of a big game hunter's headroom, walls covered with elephant tusks and moose antlers. Yet it bore a kind of purity too, like a scientist's lab or the inner sanctum of a temple. At the makeshift encampment, Anna and Billy were staring warily into the trees as the black shade of darkness caused objects to merge in a mass of tricks and shadows. Fueled by their fear, their imaginations played havoc as they gaped at the pitiless jungle, each with his own inadequate god. Ramirez had just finished setting up Hawkins' radio and began twisting knobs frantically in search of a frequency that would connect the commandos with their lifeline, the standby choppers waiting just over Cantamana's border. Dylan stood by, holding the handset, and started to speak as broken crackles of static began to sputter from the speaker. Blazer 1, come in. Red Fox here, over. In return, he could hear a barely audible voice garbled with interference. Blazer 1 here. Position and status, Red Fox, over. Dylan winced nervously. He hadn't ascertained their coordinates, but knew they had to be within a few miles of safety. That tantalizing couple of miles that mocked them like 1,000 in their sudden danger. Blazer 1, Mayday! We're just over the border near the river. Enemy camp destroyed. 2 dead, guerrillas in pursuit. Need immediate pickup. Circumstances critical. Over. Indeterminable seconds passed as the men huddled about the battered radio. Then, through waves of interference, they got their reply. Request for extraction denied. Your area still compromised. Proceed to Sector 3000 for prisoner extraction. Priority Alpha. Next contact at 10:30 hours. Dylan's face went pale with rage as he listened to the orders. Roger, Blazer 1. Over and out. He switched off the receiver. Dumb fucking bastards, he growled, turning to the others gathered around. What the hell do they think this is? Tag? Schaefer watched Dylan with the hint of a smirk playing about his lips. At last he could hear an echo of the old ghetto fury welling up in his former compatriot. What's the matter, Dylan? Teased the major. Limo out of gas? Expendable assets, pal. Remember? He spoke with a savage irony. Seems Langley's never around when you need him, huh? We should have requested a little tour in Syria. Transportation's regular, and they got TV cameras up the ass. We're still too far in, Dylan replied tightly, ignoring Schaefer's taunts. But Schaefer wasn't buying Dylan's version anymore. Bullshit. You're just like the rest of us now. The Major was thinking to himself that if it weren't for the darker situation of the alien, he'd be just as happy to flatten Dylan, whom he thought of now as a coward at worst, and at best as a hopeless incompetent. Dylan glared back at Schaefer, silently reading his thoughts, the dead receiver lying useless in his upturned hand. The men waited to see if the confrontation would explode, eager for it, really. But then the Major stood up and turned abruptly to Ramirez, who was craning his eyes at the impenetrable canopy of vines and branches. Shitload of good a chopper will do us in here anyway, the Chicano sneered. Dylan turned to Mac, determined to establish command again. Who hit us today? He asked sharply. Don't know. Only saw one of them, Mac answered vacantly. Camouflaged. Kinda like Spider-Man. He was over there, he said, pointing into the rugged chaparral, recalling the chase. His words trailed off with his terrible memories. Those fucking eyes, he muttered, numb and awestruck. Then he shivered in the steamy night, though the temperature still hovered just under 100. Dylan interrupted impatiently. What, Sergeant? Those eyes! Mac turned, shaken, glaring at Dylan and shouting angrily. It was like looking straight into hell. But I know one thing, he swore with huge conviction. I drew down and fired right into his heart, capped off 200 rounds, and then my pistol, the full pack. His hands were shaking with murderous rage. Nothing on this earth could have lived, not at that range. At the end, his voice was a roar of defiance, as if he would throttle Dylan if the black man dared to contradict him. As Dillon digested Mac's fury, the burly soldier stood up and grabbed his gun. "I've got the first watch," he declared as he walked away. For all the inexplicable horror he had seen, he was a soldier first. Even in the face of an enemy which seemed unconquerable, the night watch must be kept. Perhaps for Blaine's sake as much as anyone's. As Mac departed, Dillon turned to Anna. "What did you see?" he demanded in Spanish. "What happened to the man with the radio?" The rebel woman replied slowly in broken, halting English. It was the jungle," she stuttered. The hard edge, the aggressive tension, were gone from her now, as she retreated passively in fear. She wanted these men's protection, enemy or not. Politics didn't matter anymore. Life did. The American Satan was nothing to the devil that she had seen. "Christ, what the hell?" Dillon sputtered with exasperation. "Talking to you two is like trying to sell a freezer to a fucking Eskimo. Why can't you give me a straight answer?" But Anna had closed again, like a bruised orchid. Her eyelids drooped, and the old convent prayers came murmuring out of her mouth, lulling her into a peaceful stupor. Dillon wasn't going to get anything more from her. As Ramirez stood nervously by, he spotted Billy off to the side of the group, by himself. The Sioux was meditating on the night-curtained jungle around him. Aware, cat-like, absorbing every sound, his nerves live like cinders in a fire. Ramirez approached the wiry Indian. "You know something, don't you, Billy boy?" he asked. "What is it? Tell your point, man." Billy turned to look at Ramirez, his face frozen, eyes black and wide as the onyx orbs of a Mayan idol. "I'm scared," he said. And the simple hush of the remark was more horrible than a blood-curdling scream. To Ramirez's knowledge, Billy's soul had never been scared in his life, or at least he'd never admitted it. For this stoic soldier to yield to fear made Ramirez suddenly feel like he was standing naked and weaponless in a lion's den. The spunky Barrio tough was chilled to the marrow. Almost in desperation, Ramirez tried to coax the Indian out of his terror, as if it would still his own. "Bullshit, man! You ain't afraid of nothing!" It sounded strangely like a threat. Billy stood firm, his feet spread in an animal crouch. He looked Ramirez straight in the eyes. Although Billy had seen no more of the actual creature than anyone else, less, in fact, than Mac and Anna, he'd looked deeper than all the rest in his trance. "There's something out there waiting for us," he whispered, inches from Ramirez's face. "And it's not gorillas, my friend. It's not about war, and it's not about weapons, and nobody's gonna win." Dillon, who'd caught fragments of the interaction, thought Billy must be spooked. "He's just losing his cool," Dillon explained artfully to the speechless Ramirez as the Indian wandered off. "There's nothing out there but a couple of shit-ass pinko gorillas that we're gonna take down," he insisted stubbornly, as sure of their superior power as his CIA brethren had been during the bombing of North Vietnam. But despite the force of his words, there was a razor's edge of doubt in his voice, and both men knew it. Schaefer strode back over as the conversation petered out, leaving Dillon alone with no one to order around. The Major was holding his hand up, gripping the clutch of dog tags he'd taken from Davis's slaughtered men. He shoved them in Dillon's face. "You still don't get it, do you, Dillon?" he growled, his voice a mix of grief and fury and helplessness. "He took Davis, and now he wants us." The jungle lay in a hot, inert, and inky darkness, though a crisp three-quarter moon drifted in and out of the canyon mist, now and then breaking clear and shedding a cool glow over the trees. Mac was hunched in his foxhole, staring into the night, his weapon set on a tripod before him. His eyes kept catching phantoms as he gazed at the dense forest. Leaves became hands, vines, snakes. The brutal events of the day were sufficient to unbalance even this most battle-scarred vet's hard-edged attitude. He kept thinking of another time years ago, south of Khe-Sanh, where he and Blaine had survived another nightmare trap. He began to whisper aloud to himself, as if he were back in the mud and smoke, crawling overland to Pinong Bay, Blaine at his side. "Same kind of jungle," he murmured. "Same winking moon and everything, bro. A real number 10 night, remember? Just you and me, mud up our fucking noses, the only guys in the whole platoon who made it out in one piece." As his eyes darted about anxiously, he recalled that earlier night so vividly he could no longer distinguish it from now. "We crawled out right under their noses, didn't we?" he continued with a dry laugh. "Not a scratch. No fucking chili choke could ever get to you, bro," he drawled with pride. "You was just too good. Hell, if you don't stay in one piece, then neither do I. That's a deal, okay?" Then Mac shook himself back to the present, and a rush of anger took over. "I promise you this, bro," he swore with murderous intensity, the blood oath ringing in the jungle dark. "Whoever he is, I hope he's planning to hit us again, 'cause he's got my name on him like a fucking tattoo on his forehead." An electron force field surrounded the alien ship as the creature, now on the prowl again full scale, came gliding down the laser-suspended ramp and out into the humid night. As it stepped from the beam of light to the rugged ground, its humanoid form merged with the night's moonless shadows. But its masquerade went much further than the coincidence of shadow play. For the remarkable being had set another of its defensive techniques into motion. Now its very cells began to swirl and integrate with the night air, until there was no sign of the creature at all. It was as if it had realized from observing the commandos the importance of absolute camouflage, especially under cover of darkness. Thus, unlike the earlier incident of the cloning of the hawk, this time it didn't require a host animal to receive. It simply vanished, its whole substance, tissue, skins, organs, coasting on the jungle breezes, dispersed and invisible. The tracks in the soft dirt stopped a few yards from the ship at the other edge of the clearing, so that a tracker like Billy might have supposed the creature had flown off into the sky. But no, it was as disparate now as a virus, and it was on the hunt again, foraging towards the remaining commandos. Now that it had satisfied itself with a thorough examination of Hawkins' body, it was impatient for a new specimen, perhaps something even more advanced. As the alien disappeared into the darkness, the lasers silently retracted and the ramp withdrew, becoming flush with the spacecraft's glimmering surface, not a hint of a seam joint. The craft became an impenetrable shell, pure and pregnant as an egg. Then its glossy, copper-coloured exterior began to fade and cloud. It too was becoming one with the night, just as its captain had moments before. Soon it held its place invisible as a god.